Hey guys, today we plunge headfirst into a world where taking a gulp of clear water could kill you faster than a battlefield arrow. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time when thirst was a dangerous affliction, and survival meant pouring your hopes into a mug of something cloudy, fermented, and thankfully not water. Picture it, a crooked little village, smoke curling lazily from thatched roofs, pigs waddling through muddy lanes. In the middle of this pastoral scene, a stagnant well, its surface shimmering with a suspicious rainbow sheen. Behind the cottages, a sluggish stream winds through pastureland, its banks thick with human waste and tannery runoff. Want a sip? You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let us get one thing straight. Medieval folks were not idiots. They knew water could make them violently sick. Diarrhea was not just inconvenient, it was deadly. The link between filth and illness may not have been fully understood in a germ theory sense, but you did not need a microscope to notice that people who drank bad water often keeled over soon after. Wells were often shallow and easily contaminated, especially in crowded towns where chamber pots emptied onto the street. And rivers, basically open sewers. In the countryside, people tried boiling water. Sure, but that required firewood, time, and the general motivation to perform a chore you would rather outsource to your drink of choice. Enter the miracle of fermentation. A little alcohol, even in small amounts, kills harmful bacteria and preserves the drink. The process did not just make things safer, it made them tastier, too. Historians still argue whether the average medieval villager truly avoided water altogether, or just used it sparingly in cooking or with additives. It is possible that pure springs in isolated areas remained safe and valued. But in towns, where population density turned every gutter into a public health crisis, fermented drinks became the clear alternative. And while modern health guides suggest 8 glasses of water a day, your medieval peasant equivalent was likely chugging several pints of small beer, sipping cider, or, even better, nabbing a draught of the honeyed mead brewing in their lord's cellar. No one was walking around with a flask of Evian. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, water carriers sold buckets door to door, insisting their product came from pure sources, often uphill streams. But guess what? There is solid evidence that many of them just filled up at the nearest ditch and charged extra for a confident smile. Even monks, the original record keepers, warned about full waters that breed belly worms. That is not metaphorical. Parasites were real. Squirming consequences of gulping the wrong liquid. So people turned, with gratitude, to drinks that offered the illusion of safety, and sometimes the gentle embrace of a buzz. It was not just about health. It was about survival, flavor, ritual, and sheer practicality. And that is where our first hero of hydration steps in. A weak little brew with a surprisingly strong legacy. Small beer. It sounds like the name of a quaint village pub, something you politely decline at a party. But in the medieval world, small beer was a lifeline, more of a daily necessity than a weekend indulgence. It was the drink of farmers, blacksmiths, children, even nuns. Imagine trudging through muddy fields at dawn, the chill biting through your threadbare tunic. You are not grabbing a pumpkin spice latte, no. You are starting your day with a clay cup of weak ale, barely fermented, barely alcoholic, and brewed not for pleasure, but for hydration. Small beer was brewed from the 3rd or even 4th runnings of the mash, the leftovers after the good, strong stuff had already been drawn off. Think of it like tea. The first steep is bold and rich, the second still decent, the third, well, it is warm and wet. For medieval brewers, This leftover was gold. They would boil it again with water, throw in some dregs of hops or herbs, and let it ferment just enough to preserve it. The result, a murky, often sour drink with 1–2% alcohol. And it was not just for the grown-ups. Children drank small beer daily. Schools served it. Monasteries rationed it out as a matter of routine. It was safer than water, filled the belly, and could be brewed in massive quantities without wasting precious grain. In fact, many households had a copper or iron cauldron specifically reserved for brewing small beer, next to the one used for making pottage. One mainstream fact: documents from English manorial rolls show laborers being paid in beer, up to a gallon a day. It was not viewed as intoxicating but nourishing. When peasants worked harvest fields, barrels of small beer were hauled in with the tools. It was liquid bread, mild, filling, and far more appetizing than whatever was lurking in the village trough. And yes, sometimes, small beer got too small. There are records of spoiled batches going off quickly, especially in warmer months. That is where the quirky stuff comes in. Some folks spiced it up with juniper, sage, or even nettles, not for taste, but to cover the soreness. One Yorkshire account from the 14th century even claims a brewer added mashed apples and wood ash to restore the humor of a failed batch. Tasty. Historians still argue whether small beer genuinely hydrated people in meaningful amounts, or if it was mostly symbolic. Something to hold, something to sip, something to mark the rhythm of a day. There is even debate about its nutritional value. Was it calorie-dense enough to support long labor? Or was it more psychological, a comfort beverage in a brutal world? Regardless, small beer fueled society. Entire cities ran on it. In London, alewives, women who brewed and sold beer from their homes, were vital to the economy. Brew too weak, and the local officials would fine you. Brew too strong without a license, that could get you thrown in stocks. And still, the humble small beer endured. It was everyman's drink, the great equalizer between the suit-covered apprentice and the wary priest. And when small beer was not enough, or you had a special occasion on the horizon, you reached for something a little more magical, something sweet, something sacred, something Bazir, Med, the golden drink of gods, lovers, and medieval dreamers, where small beer clung to the muddy boots of the peasantry. Med floated in on velvet cloaks, honey thick and hallowed in candlelight. It was the drink of myth, of Norse warriors and Saxon feasts, of weddings and omens. In its simplest form, med is just fermented honey and water, but in practice, it was so much more, infused with herbs, spices, and sometimes even fruit, brewed in cloisters and castles. Its creation was a ritual. Honey was precious, expensive, and not something you would waste on just any old brew. That meant mead was reserved for the elite, the ceremonial, and the downright indulgent. Close your eyes and picture a long wooden hall. Tapestries flutter at the drafty edges. Warriors clank mugs as bards sing epic sagas. The mead flows, thick as syrup, golden as the firelight bouncing off polished helms. It is intoxicating not just in alcohol, but in atmosphere. The very air seems heavy with honey. The term honeymoon originates from the tradition of gifting newlyweds a month's worth of med to boost fertility and ensure marital bliss. The drink was thought to have aphrodisiac properties. And, let us be honest, a month-long drunk probably softened the blow of arranged marriage. Some med recipes called for meat. That is right. Ancient and early medieval meads occasionally included bone marrow, animal fat, or blood, fermented alongside the honey for added spiritual power. Don't worry. By the Middle Ages proper, most folks had moved on to tastier, less horror show versions. Still, imagine taking a swig and wondering if your beverage was once part ox. Mead also shows up in religious texts and rituals. Monks brewed it in abbeys, sometimes adding healing herbs like lavender or thyme. There is evidence that early Celtic Christian rites used honey wine in sacraments, making it both holy and heady. And in some regions, it was not just for parties. It was medicine, a balm for sore throats, a sleep aid, a curative for melancholy. Read Medieval Depression. Historians still argue whether mead was ever truly as widespread as beer and ale, or whether its golden reputation has more to do with surviving poetry than actual consumption. After all, it takes a lot of bees to make enough honey for a whole village. Was mead the everyday beverage of the northern tribes, or a rare luxury mostly drunk by the upper crust and immortalized in verse? Still, we can deny its cultural power. The Norse believed mead was the source of poetic inspiration, brewed in the belly of a god and passed to worthy humans. In Anglo-Saxon England, the Maid Hall was not just a bar. It was the heartbeat of community. Kings bestowed rings and favors there. Alliances were sealed with a shared cup. Even into the high Middle Ages, long after mead's prime had passed, the drink lingered like a fond memory. Shakespeare mentions it. So do courtly love poems. And in rural corners of Britain and Eastern Europe, mead never fully vanished. It just waited in the cellar, sweet and patient, for the next wedding feast. But while maids sang in feasts and flirted in love rituals, another drink was quietly filling the mugs of everyday folk. It came from orchards, not hives. It was tart, earthy, and much easier to get your hands on. Cider, the drink of windfall apples and village bonfires, did not sparkle like mead or hum like small beer, but it had a rustic charm and a solid kick. Where mead belonged in the hall and beer in the fields, cider sloshed around in both. It was the go-to drink in apple-growing regions and a staple of medieval life, especially in England, Normandy, and parts of Spain. Picture late autumn. Orchards misted over in the morning, trees shedding the last of their bruised bounty. People gather to press apples, the sweet rot of overripe fruit mingling with the tang of wood smoke. The presses are wooden, creaking, sticky with juice. Cider was not just made, it was wrung from the land, the kind of beverage that tasted exactly like the soil you walked on. Unlike mead, cider did not require expensive ingredients. Unlike beer, it did not need grain, crucial in times of poor harvest. Apples grew wild in some places and were cultivated with increasing purpose by monasteries and manor lords alike. Cider could be strong or weak, sweet or sour, and, crucially, it aged well. That made it ideal for storing over winter when fresh drinkables were in short supply. One mainstream fact: by the 13th century, cider had become so popular in southern England that some manors recorded apple orchards as taxable assets. In Normandy, local law codes described disputes over cider rights and storage barrels. This was not some novelty drink. It was infrastructure. But cider also had its quirks. In some regions, it was fermented with wild herbs or even bits of cheesecloth from previous batches. Yes, cloth cider starters were a thing. And then there is the oddball tradition of wassailing. Villagers would gather around apple trees in midwinter, singing, shouting, and pouring cider onto the roots to wake the trees and bless them for the next harvest. It was half festival, half magic, and all sticky in some places. They even fired muskets into the branches for dramatic effect. Historians still argue whether cider truly competed with beer in scale or just occupied specific niches. In grain-rich areas, beer reigned supreme. But in apple-heavy zones, cider became a cultural cornerstone. Was it ever as nutritionally vital? Perhaps not. But it was beloved and practical. Monks, once again, played a role in refining production. They mapped fermentation times, perfected pressing techniques, and wrote about storage methods. A few abbeys even developed signature blends. One particularly smug 14th century abbot, near Hereford, recorded that his cider is most agreeable to the Lord Bishop, who drank 4 cups and sang loudly thereafter. Now that is a Yelp review. And cider was not just local peasant fare. Wealthier households drank it, too, especially spiced and warmed. Think medieval mulled cider, thick with cinnamon and clove. Some physicians even prescribed it for cooling the liver, which sounds dubious but certainly beat leeches. In the end, cider filled the gap between seasons, between classes, between sweet mead and bitter ale. It was the taste of a region, a harvest in a mug, and, at its best, a toast to simple joy. But no drink in the medieval world stood entirely on its own. Every mug poured was tied to someone's authority, to a place, to a ritual. Because to truly understand what people drank, you need to understand where they drank it. The medieval world was soaked, not just in alcohol, but in meaning. Every sip came with strings attached. You did not just drink. You drank somewhere, and that somewhere said a lot about who you were, what you believed, and who controlled your options. Enter the tavern, the church, and the keg, 3 pillars of medieval drinking culture. Let us start with the tavern. Picture it, a smoky room with low beams and louder voices, ales sloshing in wooden mugs, dice clattering across scarred tables, and someone in the corner trying to play a lute with more enthusiasm than talent. Taverns were not just bars. They were the beating heart of local gossip, illicit deals, and late-night lamentations. Travelers, townsfolk, soldiers, they all rubbed elbows over drink. One mainstream fact. By the 12th century, taverns and alehouses were regulated under local law across England and much of continental Europe. They had to post signs, usually ivy leaves or bunches of hops, outside to show they were licensed to sell drink. If caught watering down their beer, they could be fined or even publicly shamed. It was serious business. Now, the church, yes, the pious ones who preached temperance and brewed some of the finest beverages in Europe. Monasteries were the original breweries, masters of fermentation, hygiene, and record-keeping. Cistercian and Benedictine monks kept recipes, tracked yeast behavior, and carefully curated their cellars. They brewed for the brothers, for guests, and for sale, and mead, often refined and bottled under the watchful eyes of abbots. Beer, improved by trial, error, and sacred patience. The monasteries even pioneered Grut, a medieval herb blend used to flavor beer before hops took over. It included yarrow, bog myrtle, and horehound. Sounds like a potion from a fantasy novel, but it was delicious, allegedly. Quirky fact incoming. Some monasteries granted monks multiple daily beer rations. The stronger the beer, the smaller the pour, at least in theory. But at one abbey in Bavaria, complaints emerged that monks were sneaking extra mugs during fasts under the argument that liquid bread does not break Lent, an interpretation both theologically sketchy and deeply relatable. Then there were the festivals, moments when tavern and temple blurred, and drinking became a civic duty. Harvest feasts, saints' days, coronations. Any excuse for a keg to roll into the square. These events were equal parts joy and chaos. Town records speak of ox roast parties where entire barrels vanished before dusk, and a mayor's wife once danced atop a table in over-merry spirits. Historians still argue whether the church enabled or limited drinking. Monks brewed with care, but bishops often condemned drunkenness. Sermons warned of taverns as dens of sin, but monks themselves were producing the very libations their superiors cautioned against. This push-pull shaped drinking norms across centuries. And finally, the keg, the physical object. Whether made of clay, wood, or animal skin, the container mattered. It was passed from hand to hand, rolled down roads, and hoisted onto shoulders. The keg was party and preservation in one. Some were tiny, for private stashes. Others were massive, hooped in iron and tapped with ceremonial flair. And in all of this, whether poured by friar, farmer, or tavern wench, drinks were not just about safety or flavor. They were about life, communal, messy, human life. In a world too often stained by war, plague, and cold, the keg kept pouring, and so they drank. Beneath stained glass windows, under starless skies, in musty cellars and sunlit fields. So now, imagine the mug in your hand. It is warm from touch, a little sticky, maybe sloshing over as you laugh too hard. Outside, it is muddy and hard, and the sky threatens rain. But inside, there is light and drink and company. That is what these medieval beverages were, not just survival, but defiance. A toast against the odds, a small joy in a difficult world. Thanks for wandering through the past with me.